Wow, thank you. Thank you very much. It's great to be here. I believe that I've worked or am working with a number of you that may be here today. So in my practice, we do evaluations for Texas workforce. So hello to those of you that I know, and welcome to those that's having a first experience getting to know me. I really love this topic. I have been studying personality disorders, personality development, so on and so forth, a really long time. And I still get very passionate about it. I still get excited about the topic. I find it exceptionally fascinating. And in the last about 6-7 years or so, there's been more money towards research for personality disorders. So we're finding out even more. We're discovering a lot of interesting facets and factors related to personality disorders. And I'm going to share a lot of that with you guys today. So let's get started, because I've probably got you all pumped up. You're all excited. So here we go. Let's go. So what we're going to do is I'm hoping to build skills to identify clients with personality disorders to effectively inform your choice of effective interventions. So how can you use this information? So I always think when I'm doing a presentation is the individuals that are participating, how can I give them something that they can use 5 minutes after the seminar, the presentation is over? So that's my goal. So hopefully it can inform your choice for effective interventions. And then the case studies that we're going to talk about and the different samples and case vignettes that I'm going to talk about, they're used to differentiate some symptom overlap, effective interventions, and the emotional management of personality disorders. We're also going to learn about those basic elements of emotional intelligence, so how to apply them to benefit your clients, for the people that you're working with, providing services for. And we want to build skills to recognize emotional intelligence deficits often seen in those individuals with personality disorder, particularly those that are in help-seeking settings. So a lot of times you'll get some resistance and there's a bit of a complexity to that. So why is this person resistant to me helping them? And why do they seem like they don't want to go forward? And we will talk about that as well. So let's get into it. Here we go. So the way I like to conceptualize personality disorders is to look at it in two categories. We have some that are treatment accepting and we have some that are treatment rejecting. Now, when we say treatment accepting or rejecting, what we're talking about is the willingness to go into treatment and explore their issues, the problems that they're having, and how they're affecting others. So in some ways, it's very similar to what Texas Workforce is doing, to what a lot of different types of counselors are providing in the services that they're providing as well. So accepting and rejecting, again, is more therapy focused in this sense, but also those that are maybe looking for help, but they may not accept that help as well. So let's just go through these a little bit. So, your individuals with borderline personality disorder, histrionic personality disorder, and dependent personality disorder. Now, we're going to break all of these down in just a moment and kind of talk a little bit about them. But when we say, again, that they're treatment accepting, these are folks that are willing to go into treatment. They're open to the idea of going in and exploring their thoughts, feelings, beliefs, behaviors, patterns, and the images that pop in their head when they get triggered and activated. Your treatment rejecting folks. Now, there's a longer list on treatment rejecting folks, and part of the complexity of personality disorders is that they're very challenging to treat. So many of them, as you can see by the list, is treatment rejecting, right? And that's your paranoid personality disorder, schizoid personality disorder, schizotypal, I don't have to say personality disorder, you guys know, narcissistic, antisocial, dependent, avoidant, and obsessive compulsive. Now, about this, what I do want to say, though, is even though I am talking about individuals and their psychopathology, right, their personality disorders, and I may say, those with paranoid personality disorder or borderline personality disorder, I'm not defining those individuals by their pathology. It just makes it easier than saying an individual along the spectrum of borderline personality disorder or an individual along the spectrum of schizoid personality disorder. So I'll simplify it as we go along. So again, we've got your treatment rejecting folks. Now, interestingly, this is a group that even though their psychopathology and their personality characteristics and traits cause great problems for those around them, that they don't really see it, because one of the universal criteria for all personality disorders is impairment. So they have that sense of impaired insight. So I realized I said impairment. What I meant was impaired insight, right? It's insight impairment. And that's because they have difficulty understanding and seeing that if I do A, it equals B. And that's because a lot of their behaviors tends not to cause ego-dystonic behavior, right? Or an ego-dystonic reaction. And what that is a sense of dissonance, where they feel uncomfortable what they did. They may feel a sense of shame or guilt or doubt or fear related to the behavior that they engaged in. So if they don't have that, it's hard to correct our behavior. Imagine if you did anything, right? So let's say that you were backing out of the driveway and you drove over your neighbor's kid's bike. If I did that, I would feel really bad. But imagine that you're backing up, you run over the bike, and you're like, shouldn't have parked there. Or you don't really care at all, and you're like, and you just drive to work, and you don't even have a second thought. Because you're not thinking about that kid. You're not thinking about the parents, that they might be mad at you. They may be disappointed at you. They're your neighbors. They're giving you the evil neighbor eye, which is worse than just the regular evil eye. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about the individuals that have that impaired insight. And there's no ego dystonia, right? That it's not ego dystonic. That they don't have any regret. They may back up over the bike and they're like, well, and they just keep going. They don't. So then when the neighbor would come over, right? And the neighbor says, you ran over my kid's bike. Typically, most of us would be like, oh, I'm really sorry. I apologize. I didn't mean to do. I didn't even see it. Completely my mistake and whatnot. These folks are going to respond in a way that it is, what are you talking about? It's just a bike. What are you talking about? Wasn't me. I didn't run it over. We saw you run it over because everybody's got cameras now, right? All over their house. We have you on the camera. Nope, not me. Wasn't me. I don't know what you're talking about. I don't know. And then you show it to them and then they try to gaslight you a little bit. And they're like, nope. Because the bike really shouldn't have been there anyway, so it's really not there, so it doesn't really count, and it doesn't really count that I backed over it and then drove off. So I don't see what your problem is. And then you're kind of like, huh? What? So that's part of it, right? We have that lack of insight, and we have that it's not ego-dystonic, okay? So it's ego-syntonic. Things that are ego-syntonic means that we're comfortable with what we do. We're in our comfort zone. So those are the individuals that are treatment rejecting as far as like their paranoia, their schizoid behaviors and perceptions, their narcissistic perceptions and traits and interactions and patterns, that there's really no sense of remorse, regret, tendency to think twice before they engage in behaviors, because a lot of times it's stimulus and response. Whereas for most of us, we probably consider the outcome and ramifications of our behaviors on others, on our coworkers, on our friends, on our family, people that we know, and things of that nature. But these folks don't. So it really adds to that sense of treatment rejecting. They don't see why they should change. And if we go down to the bottom there, I think a really good example is obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Many of individuals with obsessive compulsive personality disorder, which we'll define in just a moment, are really comfortable with their behavior, with their perfectionism, with their issues, right? So it's ego-syntonic, meaning that they're comfortable with it, right? It's not ego-dystonic, it doesn't cause them any dissonance. But what's interesting is that when you try to correct it, or you try to give them strategies, because it's causing a lot of disarray around them, people are usually very stressed out, these are very perfectionistic, highly organized individuals, and they don't like to be corrected, they don't like to hear that everything doesn't have to be just perfect. It's okay to have a 95%. It's okay to have 99%. And a lot of times what I'll hear when I'm working with these individuals in therapy is they're like, see, I don't have the problem. The rest of you do. Because I'm comfortable with my perfectionism. I don't have a problem with it. And that's that ego-syntonic. So they're rejecting. Why would I go into therapy for something that doesn't cause me any problems? Because why is it causing you any problems? Because it's not like I, drove over your kid's bike, because I don't see the problem in that. You shouldn't have had the bike there to begin with, and it's just a bike, and it wasn't me to begin with anyway. And it's like, what? So that's just to give us this idea of the complexity, the initial complexity of personality disorders. And what we're going to do is we're going to go forward and we're going to talk about the descriptions. We're going to define each, so that we can have a really good idea of what encompasses or what makes up a personality disorder. Now, when we talk about a general definition, this is a prevalent and ongoing pattern of emotional and behavioral deviation from one's cultural expectations that are influenced by one's cognitive, affective, interpersonal, and impulse control. Now, the important point here to look at is that it's cultural, the cultural expectations. So we can't necessarily say, well, that it's the majority culture. We have to consider the individual's culture when we're talking about their personalities, and personality, from my perspective, is not only how we see ourselves, but how we see others and how we see circumstances. And it also, that adds to how we encode different information, such as memories or instructions or rules. So it's important to realize that we have to look at that individual's culture and how it deviates from that culture. Okay. Also, we have to make sure that these behaviors are prevalent and ongoing patterns. So it can't be something that maybe something horrible has happened or trauma has occurred, and then this individual develops a very narrow perspective of the world. All of a sudden, they don't trust anyone. All of a sudden, they feel very unsafe, things of that nature, because that's because of the trauma. When we talk about personality, we're talking about it's prevalent and ongoing. So meaning that many instances may occur along the line, and we see that in various settings, these behaviors, emotional patterns, affective states, and tendency of an interpersonal interaction patterns remain consistent, even though they're maladaptive. So let's kind of break it down a little bit. So when we talk about cognitive, we're talking about one's way of perceiving and interpreting not only themselves, other people, but also events, how they interpret the world around them, the people in it, as well as themselves within that interpersonal domain and the intrapersonal domain, which is inside themselves. Next, we have affective. This includes the range, intensity, lability, and appropriateness of emotional response. So a lot of times you might see someone who's in the middle of a depressive episode, and they may have very flat or restricted affect, which is, it would look more like this, like, yeah, no. And it's very limited, right? It's very flat, it's very restricted. Now that would be their affect. Now, if we were going to attribute this to a personality trait or component, again, we would see it across a wide variety of different situations and circumstances. It would be prolonged pattern of behavior in response to the world around them. And also they would impact interpersonal functioning. When we talk about interpersonal functioning, this is how an individual gets along with others, as well as their social flexibility or their lack of social flexibility. Now, I tend to believe that personality disorders, if we had to break it down and define it, we would say that it's the inability to adjust your behavior based upon the environment that you're in. So what that means is that whether you're at the Cheesecake Factory, you're at work, or you're at home on the couch, your behavior stays the same. So it doesn't matter if you're talking to your kid, if you're talking to your spouse, if you're talking to your mom, or you're talking to the neighbor or the neighbor's kid, you respond the same to everyone. You interact with them the same, use the same social patterns and strategies regardless of who it is. So it's the inability to adjust your behavior based upon the environment that you're in and who's in that environment. And the more severe the personality disorder, then the more restrictive the response pattern is. Because there are some folks that are like that low moderate, because everything's on a dimension. So you can have someone who's low moderate or even mild personality traits and types, and you wouldn't really even know it, right? Because they're kind of flexible, but they're a little mild and moody, and they're maybe overreactive, and they major in the minors a little bit. They may be a little theatrical. They may be a little perfectionistic, things like that. And we see that. So what happens is that these individuals have some degree of flexibility, but underneath that, there is a degree of inflexibility. There's an inability to perhaps self-soothe or manage themselves in particular situations. So, and then there's impulse control. Impulse control is super, super important. So impulse control includes one's poor ability to manage thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Impulse control, and all of us have a different degree of impulse control, and we all have a different threshold. So, for example, some of you may be big coffee drinkers, and you may really like Starbucks a lot. No matter how much they raise the price, you're like, man, I love it, I'm going. And that's you, and that's okay. But let's say, right, you're on your way to work, and you're having a performance review, and you got to get there on time, and you got to go to your Starbucks, right? So you pull in and it's a long line, and maybe you just like the drip coffee, but you know they have coffees that are mocha lattes upside down with a little dash of coconut cream splash of whipped foam, cream on top, I don't know, all that other stuff. You know what I'm saying. So you're getting frustrated because you're thinking, oh, everybody in front of me is ordering, right, the whipped foam, mocha, upside down, and all I want is a drip. That's all I want, just a drip coffee. And you sit there and you stew on it, and finally you reach that threshold and you just start laying on the horn. You roll down the window, you're screaming out there, move it, right? And all of that, and you're getting more and more excited, more and more frustrated. So then you finally get up, you order, and then you chew out the person, who has their little headgear on, right? And you let them have it, and then you get up to the window, and then you really chew them out, and you make them cry, and then you drive off, right? And it's just this lack of impulse control. But let's say it's just at Starbucks. Remember, it is the inability to adjust your behavior based upon the environment that you're in, but it has to be prevalent and ongoing. So if it's just at Starbucks because you're stressed out, because you're going to work, doesn't count. But if it's Starbucks, then at work, then it's with your kids, then it's with your significant other, right, or your spouse, or it's with your neighbor, then that would be part of your personality trait. We would see that it would go across a wide variety of different types of situations. And then we would know that it's part of your personality. Be like, whoa, he or she, they have really bad impulse control. Like when they get worked up, they really get worked up. So let's talk about the different personality disorders specifically. Okay, so there's a total of 10 personality disorders. Now, the first one we're going to talk about is paranoid personality disorder. Now, this is a pattern of distrust and suspiciousness such that others' motives are interpreted as malevolent. Now, this is not paranoid psychosis. This is not, the government is spying on me, the government's out to get me. I hear voices that are telling me, oh, they're going to get you, don't trust them. This is different. These individuals may have a psychotic break, but if they do, it tends not to be as long or severe as an individual, perhaps with schizophrenia, someone who has a history of psychosis, or someone who falls along that schizophrenia spectrum. But when we talk about paranoid personality disorder, this is that individual who is your conspiracy theorist, but it goes one level deeper than that. Because remember, it has to be prolonged. It has to affect their ability, not only in how they see themselves, but how they see others. Now, within your field as counselors, you're likely to encounter these individuals because they have a lot of serial unemployment. And that means that they're employed for a little while. They lose their job, typically because of their rigidity, right? Their distrust of their boss, their suspiciousness, and then they're let go. And then they come back to you and are like, well, I don't know why I got fired. And then you find out, well, they refused to take out the trash, right? Because they felt, that they were the only ones that was being asked to take out the trash, and they were being treated unfairly, and they were purposely by this boss or this supervisor. So you start to see this pattern of distrust and suspiciousness. So again, this is a treatment rejecting type. They won't come see me. They don't want to come and see me. They're very suspicious of psychologists, mental health providers. So again, you folks are likely to see them because you're trying to get them back in the workforce. You're trying to get them, some services. And initially they may be okay, but the longer they're there, the harder it is to maintain and control those personality patterns because traits come out. Over time, traits come out. That's how it works. So that paranoia, which of course causes socioeconomic dysfunction, which means that it impairs their ability to earn money, go to school, or in their relationships. So of course that affects their employment stability. Let's go to the next one, schizoid personality disorder. Now this is a pattern of detachment from social relationships and a restricted range of emotional expression. Now interestingly, and I'm not going to go too deep into it, but a lot of individuals with schizoid personality disorder are misdiagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder. Because what happens is, now a lot of these personality disorders, our personalities aren't really solidified until 18. We start to see those trends and patterns really sort of solidify at 16. And from 16 to 18, they really, really solidify. And then 18 onward, those patterns are pretty much in place unless the individual chooses to change their behavior, change their outlook, so on and so forth. So for your schizoid individuals, what we see is that it's a very restricted emotional pattern. They don't see a lot of value in relationships, right? They're very rigid and restricted in the need for social relationships. They don't care about social relationships, but we can separate it from autism spectrum disorder because we don't see those repetitive patterns Also, we don't see those early developmental issues that we see with individuals with autistic spectrum disorder, which is, we see those developmental delays, things like that. We don't see that in schizoid personality disorder. That's why it's always important, I think, that if we're getting that history, we got to go all the way back to birth. I know. We got to go all the way back to birth, get a little idea about the development, social development, interaction, repetitive patterns. Were they there? Were they not? So a lot of these schizoid individuals, again, particularly lately, will be misdiagnosed with autistic spectrum. But when you look for the history, it's not there. Now, interestingly, these folks, the way I see them in my practice, I also do evaluations for Social Security. And I'll see them because a lot of times we don't have basements here in Texas, but up north where I'm from, they do have basements. So what happens is these individuals tend to stay in the basement. They're big video gamers. They may do different things just on the computer. Again, they don't have that social need, that need for social engagement. So what happens is when their caregiver passes away, a brother, sister, someone in the family sometimes, or could be a caseworker, then who applies for Social Security. That's how I would typically see them during those Social Security evaluations. Now, you may see them as well because they're going to try to get into the workforce. Now, these individuals may do well at a very restricted, concrete job where there isn't a lot of social interaction. But again, it's not autistic spectrum, it's schizoid personality disorder. Also, autistic spectrum individuals, we're always looking for what? We're looking for intellectual impairment and language impairment. These individuals have neither. They're going to have an average level of intelligence, typically, and they're also not going to have any type of language impairment. Let's go to the next one, schizotypal. There's a pattern of acute discomfort in close relationships and cognitive and perceptual distortions and eccentricities of behavior. Now, these individuals, schizotypal personality disorder is on the schizophrenia spectrum, but it's on the low end. It's on the very, very low end because they don't necessarily have hallucinations and delusions. These folks are just very eccentric and they're very different and they're very unique and they see the world in a very new and unique way. So when we see them, whether it's me or it's yourself, they present as very odd, very peculiar. We get that initial sense like something's just not right here. Maybe something just isn't flowing. The conversation tends to be a little broken, a little distorted. They may believe that they have special powers. They may believe that they are particularly unique. That goes to the perceptual distortions. They may, feel certain things. Oh, when the wind blows, it always blows cold across my crystal skin. And you're like, huh? Now, that's an eccentricity. And so we see this in these individuals. And again, it's pervasive. And we typically see that they've had a pretty, let's just air quotes on this one, a normal development. And then in adulthood, about 16, sometimes a little earlier, you might start to see those, there aren't a lot of friends. Again, they may have tried to have a job, but they can't hold it down just because of those eccentricities, of that uniqueness of behavior and perceptions, the things that they say. They may have their own slang or slogans for their life, things like that. So it's very unique in how they approach the world. They may dress very uniquely. Again, they also perceive the world very uniquely. They don't like to be close with others. They may be very distant with their parents, with their significant others, which goes back to I typically see these folks not through Texas Workforce, but more through Social Security. Again, for the same reason I would see the schizotypal individual as well. Now we're going into, this is the cluster B. This is another group. Okay, the previous three that we covered are cluster A, so this is cluster B. Now, these are folks that all of us have heard of. These are those personality disorders that are much more common, even though their prevalence is very, very low. The reason why we have heard of them is because they are particularly destructive, and I don't just mean antisocial. I mean antisocial, histrionic, borderline, and narcissistic personality disorders. They are particularly destructive, but also they tend to be more social, whereas your paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal tend to be a little more reclusive. So when we talk about antisocial personality disorder, we're talking about here, again, it's that pattern of disregard for and violation of the rights of others. And these are individuals that they are remorseless. They have no sense of regret. They run over that bike we talked about, and they're going to think it's hysterical, and they could care less. And it's really egocentric, and they're going to be just fine with it. And the reason why, they would apply for Social Security or Texas Workforce is because, they want to game the system. They want to get something out of it. How can they get something for free? How can they manipulate somebody in order to get something that they want, right? And it's all about power and profit. and dominance of others. And that's what we see in those behaviors over and over again. Now, next is borderline personality disorder. Now, this is a pattern of instability in interpersonal relationships, self-image, and affect, and marked impulsivity. We're going to do a little deeper dive into BPD in just a moment, because I think that it is one of the most researched personality disorders. It's also one of the most misunderstood personality disorders as well. But borderline personality disorder, you have a lot of emotional instability. You have a lot of relationship disruption, but it tends to be very dark. The individual tends to fear relationships in a lot of ways, but want to be close in those relationships. I call it a push-pull type of relationship. I want to be close, but not that close. But why aren't you closer? Because we should be closer. Why aren't we close enough? Because we're not close enough. But shouldn't we be close enough? You wanted to be close enough, but we're not. And then because of that, that causes me to believe that I am negative, I am broken, I am worthless, and I respond to that sense of internalized brokenness with acting out behaviors, destructive behaviors. We have histrionic personality disorder. This is a pattern of excessive emotionality and attention seeking. These are folks that need to be in the spotlight. They need to be the center of attention. And the way they go about it tends to be very maladaptive and destructive. These folks are really high energy. They can be a lot of fun initially because they love novelty, they love engagement, but they will drain you because they take and they take and they take energy from you on a consistent basis, so you get exhausted, and then they lose friends and relationships that way. Narcissistic personality disorder, which all of us have heard, which is a pattern of grandiosity, need for admiration, and lack of empathy. This is that I'm going to engage in maladaptive patterns that show how great, special, and unique I am. And those maladaptive patterns are going to cause you a lot of stress and really cause you a lot of anxiety and various levels of impairment, whether it's financial impairment, emotional impairment, social impairment, whatever it is. But because I cause that, I feel empowered. And that makes me feel great. Not great like woo-woo, but great like unique, special, and powerful. So now your avoidant personality disorders. These individuals are exceptionally rare because they tend to be hermits. They tend to stay in their homes. They don't like to go out because of this intense social inhibition, feeling of inadequacy, and hypersensitivity to negative evaluation. Now, these folks, it's not like they're just, Tim is anxious. It's like anxious times 1,000. It's that they may show a lot of just intense panic type of symptoms when they're interacting with others. They tend not to. They tend to have a lot of self-doubt, a lot of great fear, and they desperately seek any type of evaluation because of that fear of it being negative, of not being accepted. Woody Allen, if you know who that is, he has a pretty strong avoidant personality because he is so afraid of being negatively evaluated. But the way he manages that is by doing the exact opposite. It's called reaction formation. So he's brilliant in his writing and things like that, but he puts himself out there to purposely be negatively evaluated in some cases, or to be perceived as unique and odd, so that then anything that comes out of that, it's not his true self, it's this persona that he has presented out. So he would be pretty high functioning for avoidant personality disorder. And then we have dependent personality disorder. This is a pattern of submissive and clinging behavior related to an excessive need to be taken care of. Now, this isn't codependency. Codependency is very different. Codependency is the need to be needed. Dependent personality, they have intensive need to rely on someone else for even basic questions, basic clarity, basic understanding of themselves. So they're like an empty jar. And they find this, it's called an external object, or another person, that's that external object, who then is to fill them up. Because without that other person filling them up, they don't know who they are. So they become dependent on that individual. And that dependency runs across every facet of their life. What they should wear, what they should think, how they should behave, what job should they have, if they should have a job, should they go to therapy. That's why they're treatment accepting, because that dependent, the object that they're dependent on, tells them that they need to go to therapy, so they do. And then lastly, we have obsessive compulsive personality disorder. This is a pattern of preoccupation with orderliness, perfectionism, and control. So I talked about this one earlier, but it's not OCD. OCD is that you have obsessive thoughts, feelings right? Or drives or a sense of urgency that is quelled, that is attenuated by compulsive behaviors. With obsessive compulsive personality disorder, there really isn't any specific behavior that's going to lessen any anxiety, because sometimes they have anxiety, sometimes they don't. This is OCPD, obsessive compulsive personality disorder. Sometimes they have anxiety, sometimes they don't, because their behavior is egosyntonic. But I'll tell you, if you ever hire someone who has obsessive compulsive personality disorder, the first 3 weeks, you're going to love them. Because they're going to organize everything, they're going to structure everything, they're going to put everything like on the desk, everything's going to be nice and neat and clean and beautiful and all this other stuff. But they don't get anything done. When you give them a task, they get lost in the details and they can't go beyond those details. So that's where a lot of that dysfunction comes from. So finding them a job, that might be great, but they're not task completers, they're task engagers. So they get stuck in those tasks over and over and over again without any completion. Let's talk about the complexity of personality disorders. And I think this is really important. Not only will this give us a really good perspective, I think, on BPD, but also give us a perspective of the complexity of BPD, of personality disorders overall. Now, all personality disorders, there's a pretty high likelihood that's going to be comorbid with another condition. That could be depression, bipolar disorder, PTSD, could be panic disorder, could be generalized anxiety, unspecified anxiety, could be anything, okay, to go with it. We're going to talk about this specifically about BPD, just to give you an idea. So approximately 3 to 15% of all individuals diagnosed with BPD don't have a co-occurring condition or comorbid condition. This is what's called pure BPD. When it's only the personality disorder, it's called pure. But the other side of this coin, because we have 3 and 15% is pure, the other side is 85 and 97% of all individuals with BPD have at least one comorbid condition. So we know that if we find a personality disorder, there's usually something else lurking around that's also adding to the complexity and the challenge of working with this individual, of this person helping themselves as well. Now, when we talk about BPD and bipolar disorder, so they're comorbid in about 27.6% of cases. Now, to work with this, we have to stabilize those bipolar episodes first, because we can't work on the personality disorder if we don't have those manic phases under control or those depressive episodes under control, because they're very disruptive to the treatment process. Also, when we look at major depressive disorder, 83% of individuals with BPD also qualify major depressive disorder. So BPD, that core content, what those issues are that's underneath that drives a lot of those maladaptive beliefs, behaviors, and patterns, we have to address those first. So this is different than bipolar disorder because we have to get to that core content. We've got to deal with the BPD in order to manage the major depressive disorder. Because if we don't, what happens is that if we just focus on the depression, let's say we give them Zoloft, let's say we try some CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but they're not really going to engage in those strategies because the BPD maladaptive patterns are too strong and keep pulling them towards those depressive episodes. And then we have psychosis. When we talk about psychosis, hallucinations, which is a central component of brief psychotic disorder and other psychotic disorders, have been estimated to occur in 26 to 54% of individuals diagnosed with BPD. Now, what that tells us is that there's a high prevalence of those with BPD to have a psychotic break, just as I mentioned, also in paranoid personality disorder. Also, in that schizotypal personality disorder, we know that they are along that spectrum of schizophrenia. Now, delusions, that's another key component of psychotic disorders, and this is found in about 17 to 29% of BPD. And those delusions, those are beliefs, right? They're beliefs in that the world is out to get you. There's beliefs that you love me or that I love you when I really don't, right? And that you may see, oh, well, I mean, you know, he's not coming in today because he's probably going to get a haircut so he can look just beautiful for me tomorrow because I know he's got this huge crush on me, right? That you would say that about me. But I really, maybe I don't feel well. Maybe I stubbed my toe and I'm not coming in. I don't know. But it's part of that delusion. Now, psychotic symptoms must be controlled prior to working with BPD. So we have to get those psychotic episodes managed, and that's typically with medication. And over the years, many more medications have had greater degree of efficacy with fewer side effects. So it's really been able to manage those psychotic episodes as well as decreasing the probability of individuals with BPD or other personality disorders having psychotic breaks. But by the way, I'm not saying that everybody with BPD or personality disorder needs an antipsychotic. I'm not saying that at all. So it's estimated that 10 to 24% of individuals with BPD also meet criteria for dissociative identity disorder. And this is a really controversial diagnosis. And dissociative identity disorder, again, is on a spectrum. On the far end, extreme end, it's individuals who believe that they have separate selves inside themselves and come out under different degrees of stress or under different situations. Whereas at the lower end, these are individuals who separate from themselves and sort of live more in like a Twilight, not the book Twilight, but more like in a sense of Twilight, dreamy kind of world, because they are physically or cognitively or psychologically pulled back from the world in which they live in. Now, when these two disorders are comorbid, BPD and dissociative identity disorder, clinical symptoms are more severe as opposed to when they occur separately. So now grounding strategies have to be in place. This is your mindfulness strategies, your grounding techniques. And you have to learn those first if we know there's any dissociation associated with any personality disorder, but in this case, we're talking about BPD. Now, ADHD, that's estimated to occur in about 38% of individuals with BPD, and 14% of those diagnosed with ADHD in childhood later develop BPD. So we see that there is some connection. Is it a massive connection? No, but there is something there. So it's something that we have to pay attention to. So we know if the BPD, what is that attention? Could they meet criteria for ADHD? Yes. Is it going to be higher than the likelihood for someone who doesn't have BPD? Yes. Okay, it's probably going to be about a third higher. Now, it's best to have ADHD symptoms under control, because when you're trying to teach management techniques, if you can't attend to it or sit down and pay attention to it because you're too hyperactive and impulsive, it of course is hard to learn a new skill because we're not paying attention to it. Now, PTSD or complex PTSD, what you find is 71% of those diagnosed with BPD experienced at least one instance of childhood adversity, and this includes emotional, physical, or sexual abuse or neglect. Now, one of the falsities or the false beliefs about BPD is that everyone develops BPD out of sexual trauma. That's absolutely not true, as this research shows here. And this research has been found over and over again. Not all individuals with BPD have experienced sexual trauma. So it's important to know that. And when we break it down, we see that 49% report physical neglect, 42% report emotional abuse, 36% report physical abuse, 32% sexual abuse, and 25% report emotional neglect. So it's estimated PTSD co-occurs in about 24 to 58% of those with BPD. Trauma is common, but it's not a prerequisite for BPD. And it's important because a lot of people believe trauma, BPD, oh, they must have trauma in their past. Not everybody does. So a study that focused on looking at PTSD, complex PTSD, and BPD found that 55% of those who had BPD also met criteria for PTSD. And 45% of those with BPD met criteria for complex PTSD. So we see a lot of this connection. We see that the complexity of these disorders. And if we see complex PTSD or PTSD and BPD, we treat them simultaneously. So we work with the trauma while we're also building skills and behavior management skills as well. So are personality disorders treatable? They are treatable, but in the individual, we have to see motivation and we have to see a degree of insight, some degree of insight, a willingness to accept insight. And the areas that we're going to address, this includes their thoughts, feelings, and emotions about not only how they see themselves, but how they see others. And we're working to change those maladaptive patterns to adaptive strategies. So instead of them being destructive, hurting themselves, hurting others, acting out violently, what we want to do is teach them to slow down and process and think, right? Let's say if you have a personality disorder and you're very impulsive and you're in that Starbucks line, instead of laying on your horn, you're like, let me just send a text or an email to my boss, let them know I'm currently stuck in traffic. You don't have to tell them it's Starbucks traffic. It's okay. All right. You're stuck in traffic. You're going to be a little late. Right. That's an adaptive strategy. And you want to build pro-social interpersonal skills. Those are interpersonal interactions that help to build positive relationships and connections to others. Now, the ability to recognize, understand, and manage our own emotions and to recognize, understand, and influence the emotions of others is emotional intelligence. It's the ability to recognize not only how I feel and how I think, but also be able to interpret those thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and degree of comfort or being uncomfortable in someone else. So let's talk about our low EQ person. A lot of times you'll hear people with low emotional intelligence say, if I only had a different job, if I only had finished graduation, if I only had been handsome, beautiful, if only my spouse had stopped drinking, if only I had been born rich and famous, if only I had good contacts, if only I had better friends, if only I had married someone else. And that's low EQ, right? And because it's all of these things mashed together. And it's this expectation of not looking at strategies, not looking at ways of doing it differently, but being stuck in these phrases that keep them stuck because they don't realize that they have to take responsibility for their behavior to do it differently. So for your high IQ person, it's a time to wait and a time to watch. It's a time to be aggressive and a time to be passive. It's a time to be together and a time to be alone. A time to fight and a time to love and a time to work and a time to play. So you get the idea of the balance, right? It's a balance between the two. And you're reading yourself, the situations and the environment, and you're able to interpret that. And you're able to recognize that there's particular behaviors that's going to increase the probability of success within these different environments with these different people. And that's what emotional intelligence is. And people with high emotional intelligence are typically very charismatic. And when we say charismatic, this is exactly what we mean, is that they know how to interact. They feed off your emotions. They respond to your emotions. They can tell how you feel. They can tell certain phrases and reactions that you like and you respond to and those that you don't. And they're able to adjust, as opposed to, we go back to our definition of that inability to adjust your behavior based upon the environment that you're in. Most individuals with a personality disorder have low emotional intelligence. So let's talk about the 10 habits that can help us build emotional intelligence. Hey, what we want to do is build what I call emotional literacy. And this is labeling our feelings rather than labeling people or situations, right? To say, I feel impatient, as opposed to, this is ridiculous. I feel hurt and bitter, as opposed to, you're an insensitive jerk. Emotional literacy is, I feel afraid. You recognize your own emotions and how you're feeling, as opposed to, you're driving like an idiot. So one is low emotional intelligence because it's external. You're blaming others as opposed to taking that sense of responsibility. Number two is distinguish between your thoughts and feelings. A thought is I feel like, I feel as if, I feel that. And then you use a feeling word, right? Happy, mad, sad, glad, shy, afraid, bored, whatever it may be. But you're able to connect those thoughts, I think this, I feel this, that recognition, and attach that feeling word to it. You're going to take more responsibility for your feelings, such as I feel jealous, as opposed to you're making me jealous. And then next is use your feelings to help make decisions. Now, how I feel if I lay on my horn and chew out the Starbucks person. You're likely to get spit in your coffee, I would imagine, and you don't want that, right? Nope. Or how will I feel if I don't? So again, we're looking for that balance. Emotionally intelligent people look for that balance, and they read themselves as well as the environment. They show respect for other people's feelings. How will you feel if I do this? How will you feel if I don't do this? So you consider other people's feelings, reactions, and value. And next is you feel energized, not angry, because anger makes you ignorant. That's just kind of how it is, right? We use what others call anger to help you feel energized to take productive action. That's the purpose of what anger is. The purpose of anger is to drive you to do something. Hopefully it's something adaptive. High emotionally intelligent people engage in adaptive behaviors, even when they get angry. Getting angry is understandable, right? But we have to recognize it, see it, and know where it comes from, and use adaptive strategies in order to manage it. You want to validate other people's feelings. You want to show that empathy, understanding, and acceptance of other people's feelings and where they're coming from. Doesn't mean you're okay with it, but we have to recognize that this is where they're coming from and that's their perspective. And then practice getting a positive value from emotions, such as asking yourself, how do I feel? What would make me feel better? You could ask others, how do you feel? What would help you feel better? And again, these are emotional intelligence strategies. And these are things to build in as habits so that you are building your emotional intelligence, building that skill, because it's a skill. It's not an either or. It's not you have it or you don't. It's a degree, right? It's a skill. Don't advise, command, control, criticize, judge, or lecture others. Instead, you want to listen with empathy, right? And you don't want to judge them. You want to hear other people's thoughts, feelings, beliefs, right? And what's going to drive them to their behavior. as opposed to telling them what to do. And then they say, well, why? Because I said so. That's really not a good rationalization. We probably all heard that from our folks, right? Not a really good reason to motivate people to do it. And then lastly, avoid people who invalidate you. We have to make choices of having people in our interpersonal circle that are caring, that move us forward, that help us grow, not those who take away from us our sense of value, our sense of purpose. And while it's not always possible, we have to try to spend less time with those who take your energy and take your happiness and take your hope and outlook, and instead focus on those who build you up, move you forward, and encourage your sense of growth. But also, if there are people in your life that are sappers, they kind of sap your energy, what you want to do is you want to psychologically insulate yourself from them. And the way you do that is recognizing this person is like this. This is how they are. This is how I perceive them to be. But I don't have to let their comments, their reactions, and their beliefs and perspective of the world influence me if I don't want it to. There's a lot of power, choice, and balance in emotional intelligence. But those with higher emotional intelligence earn more money, have more successful relationships with their kids, have better sex, better relationships, and tend to achieve more than those with low emotional intelligence. So is there a connection between what we try to do with our clients, coworkers, friends, and loved ones and the 10 habits? Well, absolutely, right? Because it's a lot like the stock return, right? Stock market. We want to focus and teach these goals on an ongoing basis, not only to ourselves, but we want to really live these habits every day because humans are adaptable. Whatever we do on a regular basis, we will adapt to it, whether it's healthy or unhealthy, whether it's junk food and cigarettes, or it is a healthy lifestyle and it is believing in ourselves and managing our emotions. Recognize that growth is in no way linear, not at all, but it is cyclical and jagged, just like the stock market. And you'll notice here that even though you have high highs and low lows and all of that volatility, there's growth continually. If you look at the average of 20 years in the stock market, even though you have crashes and even though you have high highs, you have continuous growth over a 20-year period. It's the same thing. We're all going to have bad days and we're all going to have great days. We're all going to have good relationships. We're all going to have crummy ones. But the idea is to recognize and have the hope and belief that by using these adaptive strategies, these healthy strategies that I just talked about, and using that sense of balance, that you will grow, right? You'll grow as an individual. You'll grow in your relationships. You'll grow in a spouse. You'll grow as a boss. You'll grow as a coworker. You'll grow as a friend. And you'll see that start to pay off, not immediately, because there's no immediate returns, even in the stock market, right? But over time, you will see a return on that investment. So thank you all for your time. I've got time. If you have any questions, please let me know, and I would love to hear them.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Fox, for that very illuminating presentation on personality disorders. We do have a few questions. The very first one, the attendee is asking, what are your recommendations for dealing with families that are treatment rejecting when the patient is treatment accepting?
So I think that most kids are treatment accepting. So I think that then what we have to do, and parents are the most complex. So what we have to do is, I believe that if you're going to work with a kid, you have to work with the family system. And the family system is what has to be open to accepting that sense of change. And even though it's scary, I think that you have to have a sense of trust in the family. I think that we have to have a sense of willingness. Just as I mentioned in the individual, you have to have insight and motivation. I think that someone who lacks insight and has no motivation, whether it's a kid, a family, or an adult, they're not going to engage in treatment and they're not going to be helpful. I think that as adults, if the adult is treatment seeking and their partner is treatment rejecting, that's usually out of fear. So sometimes what I'll recommend is if they're willing, it depends on the circumstances, but we can do couples therapy in some cases, or talking about specifically what are those rejecting beliefs. A lot of times, and we'll throw just some generalities out, is that you have females that are more treatment accepting, males are treatment rejecting, and a lot of times males are treatment rejecting because of low self-esteem, because they question, well, you're going to be in therapy, you're going to talk about me, what are you going to say about me? I don't want you to say anything bad about me. And that fear and things like that. So explaining that to the adult individual, the potential client, I think talking about that, but also certainly helping that client explain to their significant other what therapy is, what the purpose of that therapy is, and that can also lessen some of that fear and concern.
Excellent. Thank you for that explanation. There is one more question, and the attendee is asking about the difference in interpersonal relationships and parasocial relationships in the context of personality disorders. I think this is when you were talking about the cluster A. This is when the question came up. So they're saying, for instance, feeling as though an internet personality, especially in the day and age of social media, is an actual friend versus identifying friendship in real life.
Yeah, so I think that if we look at just that cluster A, they may feel more comfortable in those online relationships because there isn't as much depth, right? So those online relationships, there really isn't a lot of depth. And that's why right now we have the highest degree of loneliness in the world's population than we ever have, but we have also the highest degree of connectivity. And so that's leading to all of these mental health issues, such as depression, anxiety, and things of that nature. So if we look at sort of friends and things like that, I think that those that are in your cluster A don't really have, let's say, adaptive social skills. So it's easier for them to have those linear friendships and connections as opposed to having that in person, because those in-person relationships tend to be deeper. So typically you won't see someone in cluster A want to increase their socialization, because again, their comfort zone is in that online relationship perhaps, or having no relationships.
The attendee did provide some more clarification. They're saying, how would you help a customer understand the difference between parasocial and in real life type relationships, as well as how to support them in creating new strong relationships? But it sounds like some of it is motivational as well. They may just not be interested in pursuing some real life relationships if they're connecting with the online.
Absolutely. And I think that we see this a lot in individuals that are in their early 20s, late teens, and those who grew up with social media. They don't really know how to approach significant others a lot of times. They don't really know. They have this sense of loneliness. They don't know how to make friends. They know how to like stuff and heart stuff, on Instagram and things like that, but they don't really know how to engage and build those deeper relationships. So I think that a way to help someone do that is to, first of all, normalize that and say, a lot of folks feel that way, and connect it with loneliness and say, a lot of folks feel like, they're online friends, but then yet they have a lot of online friends, but they also have a lot of loneliness. And you will be surprised 99% of the time, you're going to see them say, yeah. And say, it's interesting because I think a lot of people feel that way, and sometimes they struggle with kind of connecting with folks and clicking and things like that. And you should get more, yeah. And so, so then what you can find them is find them a socialization group, or I know a lot of libraries do have like book clubs and socialization groups and things like that they've started to bring back since, COVID is relatively under control. I don't know, it depends on your perspective. But so I think, again, recognizing that difference, but again, because what we're trying to do is build that motivation in order for them to seek out more real life friendships, because those are the ones that create depth. Those are the ones that the research shows decrease anxiety, decrease depression, and increase emotional intelligence by teaching those habits in the real world. Emotional intelligence utilized online have no or very little impact on the individual's self-esteem and self-concept. So we want to build insight by pairing that loneliness with online friendships, which typically they're going to experience, and then connecting it with building that motivation to seek out positive treatment and relationship depth.
That's an excellent suggestion. Thank you so much. Well, that wraps up all of the questions that we had, but there are numerous compliments and positive feedback for your presentation. Thank you so much for your time. We do appreciate you being here and sharing this insight and giving us all some food for thought about emotional intelligence and working with our customers with BPD or other personality disorders.
Yeah. Well, thanks. And I really enjoyed it. So thank you. I hope everyone enjoyed it as well. And thanks for everyone's time. I appreciate it.
Definitely sounds that way. Thank you.
Thank you.